Tonight, I'm very excited to welcome Jonathan Rosenberg to Politics and Prose, celebrating his new work, Dangerous Melodies, Classical Music in America from the Great War through the Cold War. Professor of U.S. History at Hunter College and the Graduate Center of the City University of New York, as well as a Juilliard-trained musician and a Harvard-trained historian. Rosenberg combines his areas of expertise for a unique look at the nexus of 20th century world politics and classical music. During World War I, for instance, American concert audiences rejected German works, and some German musicians were even dismissed or imprisoned. By contrast, the focus during the Second World War was on Russian compositions being used to cement the U.S. Russian alliance. Rosenberg carries his story through the Cold War, as the State Department began sending symphony orchestras around the world to act as anti-communist ambassadors. Jonathan is also the author of How Far the Promised Land and co-authored Kennedy, Johnson, and the Quest for Justice, the Civil Rights Tapes. So please, without further ado, join me in welcoming Jonathan Rosenberg.
Well, thank you very much for coming out this afternoon. It's nice to see such a large crowd for a book on classical music. And I'd like to begin by asking a couple of questions. The first, does art matter? And the second, what about artists? As we reflect upon American society today, it can seem that art and the artist have very little impact on our lives. But Dangerous Melodies is about a time, and it wasn't all that long ago, when art and artists were extraordinarily important, and I'm thinking specifically about classical music in America. I'd like to take you back to the streets of New York City, 1958. That May, 100,000 New Yorkers turned up to watch the ticker tape parade honoring pianist Van Cliburn, the winner of the Tchaikovsky competition. It had been held in Moscow a few weeks earlier. Cheers rained down on the pianist as the parade snaked up Broadway. America's newest celebrity was sitting in the back of an open car, blowing kisses, waving to the adoring crowd. A few weeks earlier in Moscow, Premier Nikita Khrushchev was an enthusiastic participant in the Cliburn affair. Millions of Americans read about the way he playfully chatted with the young pianist at a Kremlin party. Famously, the Russian even gave the American a bear hug. Upon the musician's return, Cliburn mania swept the country. He was invited to the White House to meet with Dwight Eisenhower. Eisenhower was not particularly interested in classical music. He was a painter, apparently. People read breathless press accounts of Cliburn's every move. They read about his Baptist roots. They were asked to ponder whether this victory in Moscow would somehow transform the U.S.-Soviet relationship. Can one imagine such a thing today? Would the overseas accomplishments of a gifted artist capture the attention of America's political leaders? Or the country's newspapers and magazines? Would a ticker tape parade attracting 100,000 fans be held for a classical musician? Clearly, the answer is no. But in an earlier time, a pianist's triumph could mesmerize the American people. Few would question, I think, the notion that classical music has little relevance in America. Its connection to the larger culture is tenuous. And for nearly all Americans, the classical music landscape is very much alien terrain. But this wasn't always so, and Dangerous Melodies tells the story of an age when the music occupied a prominent place, not just in the nation's cultural life, but in its political life as well. And to tell that story, I explore the connection between the world of classical music in the United States and some of the crucial international developments of the 20th century. Classical music, I would suggest to you, was once genuinely consequential in America. And that was so in no small part because the world of classical music became intertwined with momentous events that were unfolding across the globe. The classical music community was entangled in the two world wars the United States fought against Germany, with the Soviet Union, a U.S. ally in World War II. That community, the classical music community, was enmeshed in the rise of Italian and German fascism between the wars, and it was bound up in the struggle that America waged against the Soviet Union after 1945. And these three countries, Germany, Italy, and the Soviet Union, were wellsprings of rich musical traditions and the birthplaces of distinguished musical figures. And Americans had long admired both those traditions and the musicians who embodied them. It was difficult, therefore, for people in the United States to separate America's relations with Germany, Italy, and the Soviet Union from the music and musicians of those three lands. As a result, the American classical music community was drawn into the swirl of international politics, and the intersection between that community and events overseas supplied classical music with a degree of political significance that I think is now difficult to comprehend. Dangerous Melodies is filled with stories about illustrious singers, instrumentalists, conductors, and composers, but it looks too at the way listeners responded to classical music. And a key point is that over many years, Americans imbued the music with political and ideological meaning. The world of classical music helped Americans decide what was worth fighting for and why. It helped illuminate the meaning of democracy, freedom, and patriotism. It supplied insight into the nature of tyranny and oppression, and classical music and the work of classical musicians helped Americans reflect upon the country's purpose in what was a dangerous century. What was the role of the United States in the world? Let me tell you about some of the stories that I uncovered and that sort of populate this book, as it were, starting with the First World War. Wars can do peculiar things to societies. World War I was no exception. It caused poisonous attitudes to bubble to the surface of American life. The German state and its people were portrayed in barbaric terms in this country. German Americans and all things German would be scorned. The German language was no longer taught in schools. German books were taken from library shelves. There were book burnings in the United States of German writings. More trivially, sauerkraut became Liberty cabbage, hamburger, Liberty steak. More seriously and grimly and disturbingly, Germans were tarred and feathered. They were beaten. A drunken mob lynched a German laborer in a small Illinois town. German music and musicians did not escape the fury. The concert hall became a battleground, a place upon which ethnic animosity and patriotic aspirations would be contested. Keep in mind that rehearsals of U.S. orchestras in this period took place in German. Most orchestral repertoire was German, as were the musicians and conductors who performed that music. Many believed in the United States that the war effort could be fortified by dictating who could conduct, who could perform, and what could be played. Let me turn to Boston, the home of what was considered the finest symphony orchestra in the United States at that time. Of course, Boston has a wonderful symphony orchestra today. The Boston Symphony had a German-born music director, a man by the name of Karl Muck. He was one of the most celebrated conductors in the world, and his problems began when it was alleged that he had refused to play the Star-Spangled Banner at a concert in Providence, Rhode Island, in October 1917. In fact, what had happened was that Muck had not been informed of the request to play the piece. The orchestra didn't have the music with them. They weren't prepared to play it, and they didn't. Things quickly spiraled downward. The Muck affair became a national phenomenon. It was covered widely in the press. In Philadelphia, Theodore Roosevelt, who was never reluctant to inject himself into a debate, told a crowd, "Any man who refuses to play the Star-Spangled Banner in this time of national crisis should be forced to pack up and return to the country he came from." In Baltimore, The Boston Symphony had been scheduled to perform there. That concert was canceled. It was thought that a riot might erupt. And the anti-Muck sentiment was spearheaded there by a politician, a former governor, who said, if necessary, he would lead a throng of thousands to keep Muck off the stage. Now, there was no concert in Baltimore, but a large rally was held nonetheless. Calls for Muck to be killed rang out at this rally. It was a truly vicious scene. Back in Boston, on the night of March 25, 1918, Karl Muck was arrested. He wasn't charged with anything, but he was hauled off to jail, to a Cambridge jail, and a few weeks later he was shipped off to Fort Oglethorpe, Georgia, after the U.S. government labeled him a dangerous enemy alien. He would spend the rest of the war in a prison camp along with thousands of other German aliens. In the book, I have a great deal of discussion on the Muck saga, including a love affair with a young Boston singer, which became public knowledge after Muck was arrested, and it further inflamed the situation. The Muck episode became even more troubling when authorities began to accuse him of espionage. Among several alleged acts, he was said to have secretly signaled to German vessels at sea from a cottage that he was renting on the Maine coast. He was also said to have been involved in a conspiracy to blow up Longfellow's house in Cambridge. There's no credible evidence supporting this or any of these allegations. Karl Muck was not a spy. He was a faithless husband. We can attest to that. After the war, several months later, he was released from the prison camp and deported. He would never again conduct in the United States. Throughout the country, German music and musicians were the target of anti-German hatred. In New York City, no German opera would be played by the Metropolitan Opera Company. German singers were dismissed. In New York as well, a ban was placed on the pieces of living German composers. Now, there were some who opposed this decision. There was a debate in the United States about whether these policies were reasonable. One leading publication noted that it was absurd to ban the music of living German composers. It was said, after all, if Richard Strauss were to die tomorrow, his music would suddenly become acceptable. How foolish is that? But these bans were widespread. The music of living German composers was targeted. Wagner operas were also banned. These policies differed in different cities. Pittsburgh had probably the most draconian policy in the country. It swept away all German music entirely during the war. In Cincinnati, which was the home of one of the great orchestras in the country at that time, there was an Austrian conductor, a man by the name of Ernst Kunwald. He was imprisoned. He was sent to the same prison camp as Karl Muck. He'd committed no crime. In Chicago, several German musicians in the Chicago Symphony Orchestra were fired. They, too, were charged with no crimes. The orchestra had a gifted and rather celebrated principal cellist, a man by the name of Bruno Steindl. He was dismissed after being accused of adding obscene lyrics to the Star-Spangled Banner. He'd also remained seated during a performance of the Marseillaise. He was interrogated about this, and he said, "I couldn't stand and continue to play my cello." He was fired from the orchestra. With the end of the war in November 1918, this did not mean that anti-German hostility in America came to an end, far from it. In the fall of 1919, 1 year after the war ended, blood was shed and gunfire rang out on the east side of New York City, when large, violent protests erupted over performances of German opera, a year after the end of the war. The atmosphere was toxic, people were beaten up. The opera company was soon forbidden from playing German opera, and it went out of business almost immediately thereafter. Gradually, Americans would again begin to hear German music. Many still adored the music, and by the mid-1920s, the music was being played again in the United States. In fact, even a little bit before that. By the 1930s, developments in Germany again aroused concerns. In 1936, America's most famous conductor, Arturo Toscanini, decided to step down from his position at the New York Philharmonic. And within days, the matter of who would replace Toscanini became entangled in foreign affairs. the distinguished German Wilhelm Furtwängler was atop the list of possible successors. At the time, he and Toscanini were the two most esteemed maestros in the world. Furtwängler headed the Berlin Philharmonic in Hitler's Germany. When the New York Philharmonic announced that Furtwängler had agreed to succeed Toscanini, the story was covered widely in newspapers across the country. And an artist who could be linked to the Nazis, and many did precisely this with Furtwängler, was an unappealing presence in the United States. People were convinced that Furtwängler's actions, starting when Hitler came to power in 1933, made him an altogether unsavory figure. Rather than leaving Nazi Germany, Furtwängler had decided to remain, and he was working there as an artist under the Hitler regime. Almost immediately, a group of New York Philharmonic subscribers canceled their subscriptions for the upcoming season. A Jewish business leader called it unthinkable to appoint an official of the Nazi government to lead America's foremost musical organization. And the key question was this: to what extent was Furtwängler a supporter of and complicit in the policies of Nazi Germany? Heartfelt letters appeared in local newspapers. In the New York Times, a woman who planned to cancel her Philharmonic subscription said, "As a member of the race which they abused, I am stunned that the sanctuary of music in America had been successfully invaded by the hordes of Hitler." Now, mind you, this is 3 years before the start of the war. There were some who disagreed with this position. They argued that Furtwängler had, in fact, acted honorably in Germany. There was a debate over this question. He was not a member of the Nazi Party. There was some evidence to suggest that he opposed Hitler. At least early on, he had refused to dismiss Jews from the Berlin Philharmonic. To some, Furtwängler's actions suggested an aversion to Nazism. But many rejected this view out of hand. In fact, I would say most rejected it. The American Hebrew, a Jewish weekly, called Furtwängler the highest musical official of a government which has relegated musical art to the gutter. Responding to the ferocious opposition which had blown up, Furtwängler withdrew his acceptance. He would not come to New York. He sent a cable to the Philharmonic. It was at once high-minded and patronizing. "Political controversies disagreeable to me. Am not politician, but exponent of German music, which belongs to all humanity, regardless of politics." Wilhelm Furtwängler's fate was sealed by the furious opposition among those who refused to support an artist whose ties to a malevolent regime were at best questionable and possibly far worse than that. It's worth noting, and I'll add it parenthetically, although I devote a lot of time to it in the book, after World War II, the Chicago Symphony offered Wilhelm Furtwängler a position as its music director. This happened in 1948. The same furious storm arose. For a time, it wasn't clear whether he would come to Chicago. He then withdrew his acceptance and was unable to come, and the orchestra had to make other arrangements. So 1936, then after the war, 1948, in fact, I would say the reaction was even more furious because of what had happened in the ensuing years. Let me turn to the Second World War and say some things about that. Americans witnessed a powerful illustration of music's capacity to fortify the war effort. The performance of a Russian composition became the most sensational classical music story of the war. The country's encounter with Dmitri Shostakovich's Seventh Symphony in 1942 makes quite clear, I think, how music and politics were intertwined. In June of 1942, NBC announced that the Seventh Symphony would be premiered in the United States in a July broadcast by the NBC Symphony, led by Arturo Toscanini. The orchestra had been established for Toscanini in 1937. This concert would be heard by millions of people across the country on NBC stations, and it would also ultimately be broadcast across the world. Now, adding weight to the event was the fact that the symphony had been composed by an artist from the Soviet Union, a crucial, if at least early on, uncomfortable wartime ally of the United States. And the symphony meshed with the U.S. government's desire to strengthen the bond between Washington and Moscow. The NBC press release captured the drama of the moment, noting the piece had been composed by Shostakovich while he was living, quote, under the flame and fire of the Nazi attack on Leningrad. NBC said the symphony was inspired by the Soviets' repulsion of the Nazi hordes. And in fact, Shostakovich was living with his family in Leningrad, composed, I think it was the first 3 movements of the symphony before he was evacuated from Leningrad. On July 19, 1942, the Shostakovich Seventh received its first U.S. performance. As I said, it was heard by millions of people across the country. The concert was widely covered in the press. The Sunday afternoon broadcast was preceded by highly political remarks that contrasted German brutality with Russian heroism and American altruism. Listeners were told that the work's finale would, quote, hail the ultimate victory of light over darkness, of humanity over barbarism. The cover of Time magazine pictured a stern-faced Shostakovich in a wartime fire marshal's helmet staring resolutely into the distance with burned-out buildings in the background. And Shostakovich remained in the news. The nation's leading symphony orchestras performed the symphony during the end of the summer and throughout the fall. The piece became a nationwide phenomenon. In Cleveland, the distinguished conductor of the orchestra there, Artur Rodzinski, called the performance of the Seventh not just one of the greatest musical events in years, but one of the greatest political events. It was played out in Los Angeles, 2 performances in October of 1942. The first was in the auditorium that the symphony normally used. The second was for thousands of soldiers at a desert army base. This being Southern California, the person who introduced the proceedings that night was Edward G. Robinson, the actor. He supplied the opening remarks. I'll try my best to do an Edward G. Robinson. I warn you, it's not very good. Listen, yous mugs. Pipe down now for the big doings. The Hollywood tough guy then described Shostakovich's heroism during the siege of Leningrad. The LA Times said thousands of soldiers were enthralled as the musical spirit of war came to Cactus Land. Even a year after the premiere, Newsweek magazine could claim that the whole world now knows of Dmitri Shostakovich. I think it's difficult to imagine something like this happening in contemporary America, that a piece of classical music could take on not only such political meaning, but could capture the attention and imagination of the American people. I want to turn now to the post-war years, when the country's gaze shifted from fascism to a different threat. America's obsession with communism quickly swept across the landscape. And even a beloved American composer wasn't spared. Aaron Copland would be hauled before Senator Joseph McCarthy's committee in 1953, and the session featured Joseph McCarthy, the Wisconsin senator, and lo and behold, his chief counsel, Roy Cohn, who has been in the news in recent months. It was a cat-and-mouse game, a nimble Copland darting to and fro, doing his best to avoid being caught in his inquisitor's claws. McCarthy posed the crucial question, Mr. Copland, have you ever been a communist? Copland stated that he had never been a communist and was not one currently. Then he was asked if he'd ever been a communist sympathizer, and he was a little less direct. He said, I'm not sure that I would be able to say what you mean by the word sympathizer. Asked if he had ever attended a Communist Party meeting, he replied, I'm afraid I don't know how you define a communist meeting. Were any of your close friends communists? Not to my knowledge, he said. Throughout the hearing, Copland claimed that he was not a politically engaged person. His attention, he said, was focused on composing. Later on in his diary, he wrote, my conscience was clear. In a free America, I had a right to affiliate openly with whom I pleased. The key point here is that after the war, the world of classical music became entangled in America's irrational fear of Soviet communism. And over the next several years, some of the country's greatest symphony orchestras would be drawn into the East-West struggle in an effort to counter the communist threat. With Stalin's death in 1953, U.S. leaders began to conceptualize a new approach toward the Soviet Union, which created space for something that would become known as cultural diplomacy. Between 1953 and 55, the Russians dramatically increased the number of dance and theater groups and musical organizations that they were exporting to countries around the world. Now, for U.S. policymakers, this was concerning. It demonstrated Moscow's effort to convince the world that the Soviet Union was blessed with a rich, creative culture, a culture that many might wish to emulate. Dwight Eisenhower was worried. He said Europeans had been taught that we are a race of materialists whose only diversions are golf, baseball, football, and horse racing. And the U.S. orchestral tours became one way to combat such negative perceptions. Many orchestras were sent overseas by the U.S. government. I discuss a number of these tours in the book. I'd like to just focus on one here today. The New York Philharmonic's tour to the Soviet Union in 1959. This was a U.S. government-sponsored journey. The conductor was Leonard Bernstein. He headed the Philharmonic, and for Bernstein, art and politics were intertwined. Bernstein believed that classical music could empower Americans and Russians to transcend the forces that divided them. He believed that a performance by a superb orchestra could have a constructive impact on those made insecure by the Cold War. But U.S. government officials who were funding this trip thought about this rather differently. They believed that symphony orchestras could help the United States prevail against the Soviets. U.S. policymakers were convinced that a brilliant concert could fortify the nation's position with its allies and provide sonic ammunition that could be used against its adversaries. Government officials hoped that people overseas would recognize that America was capable of more than making big-budget Hollywood movies or producing bloated automobiles for American suburbanites. Violins and trumpets could help win the Cold War. Every musician on the New York Philharmonic tour in 1959 received a 28-page brochure. It was entitled, "So You're Going to Russia." It had a lengthy bibliography as well. It instructed American travelers on how to prepare for a trip to the Soviet Union, and once they were there, how they ought to behave. The pamphlet made clear that Americans visiting the Soviet Union were part of a national mission. Tourists were instructed to learn relevant facts and figures about the United States, average incomes, the sizes of American homes, the number of American telephones and televisions, just the kind of information one has when one goes on an overseas trip. They were also told to bring along a glossy magazine. Why? To make Soviet women envious. Those who did their homework before traveling to the Soviet Union were told they would know they had done their best, quote, to spread the American message of goodwill. Clearly, I think this message had less to do with spreading goodwill than with showcasing the superiority of the American way of life, of liberal capitalism. On the night of September 11th, 1959, Leonard Bernstein would conduct the orchestra's farewell concert in Moscow. This was a day filled with music. Earlier in the day, Bernstein led a program that would be shown on American television a few weeks later. And in that daytime performance, before a Moscow audience, the Philharmonic played, lo and behold, the first movement of the Shostakovich Seventh Symphony. The performance was preceded by a brilliant Bernstein lecture that explored the similarities between American and Russian music, which led Bernstein to claim that Russians and Americans were really rather alike. He said they even laughed at the same kinds of jokes. Both peoples had to work together to strengthen their relationship, Bernstein insisted. There simply wasn't an alternative. That night, the New Yorkers performed Beethoven and Shostakovich. This was the night of September 11th. And in attendance were two giants of Soviet culture, Shostakovich and the writer Boris Pasternak, author of Dr. Zhivago, whom the Soviet government had recently pilloried. In the days before the concert, a remarkable story had unfolded behind the scenes. The disgraced Pasternak was living in seclusion after being awarded the Nobel Prize for Literature. He accepted the award, but he was then expelled from the Writers' Union, and Soviet authorities forced him to turn it down. Bernstein wanted to meet him. He invited Pasternak to the September 11th concert. Pasternak accepted. In response, Pasternak asked Mr. and Mrs. Bernstein to come to his dacha for a meal. For Bernstein, this was an unforgettable experience. They spoke for hours about art and the role of the artist. On September 11th, that night, with the triumphant conclusion of what was the Fifth Symphony of Shostakovich, Shostakovich was in attendance, and Shostakovich, we should remember, had endured considerable persecution at the hands of the Soviet regime over the course of his life. At the end of the Shostakovich Fifth Symphony, Shostakovich warmly embraced Leonard Bernstein, while Boris Pasternak went backstage and said to the conductor, "You have taken us up to heaven. Now we must return to earth." The Philharmonic's visit to the Soviet Union was a dramatic moment in the history of Cold War musical diplomacy. What Leonard Bernstein did was to meld art and politics, demonstrating his belief in classical music's power to reconfigure international relations. When the orchestra, the Philharmonic, returned to the United States, they came here to Washington to play a concert for government officials and foreign diplomats. Leonard Bernstein's idealism was on display. He gave a speech at the National Press Club. "If military strength is a nation's right arm," he said, "culture is its left arm, closer to the heart. You can always touch people with music." He then linked this idea to U.S.-Soviet relations. "You can't argue with a G sharp," he said. "Khrushchev wouldn't know a B flat if he heard one." A few weeks later, millions of Americans savored the excitement of the trip when Bernstein's lecture performance from September 11th, that performance in Moscow, was shown as a Ford-sponsored CBS television documentary. The program illuminates a dramatic Cold War episode. It's an extraordinarily interesting thing to watch. I talk about it in considerable detail in the book. Dangerous Melodies explores an era in which Americans believed the work of gifted artists and superb musical institutions was inseparable from developments that were unfolding across the world. It was a time when many were convinced that their very safety might hinge on the performance of a piece of music. How remarkable it is to contemplate that millions of people once believed that what happened in the concert hall or the opera house was inseparable from the destiny of the United States and the well-being of the American people. Thank you very much. So now we will have some questions, I believe.
I thank you very much. It was great. I really enjoyed it so much.
you.
I'm just going to ask you to reflect, if you can, on why classical music has sort of descended in its importance in this country, and ask, does it have bear any relationship to politics in any way?
Okay, thank you.
It seems like immigration and diversity, the sort of changing makeup of the nation, has something to do with it. But
I would say, I touch on that question at the end of the book, and I would just say as a kind of caveat that the book doesn't really, and I don't explore in a systematic way why classical music doesn't matter today, but I'll share a few, or matters much less today, but I'll share a few thoughts Yes, I'll share a few thoughts on the matter. As I said, I don't explore that in a systematic way in the book. The book is really about the past rather than the current moment.
Right.
One of the things that I do suggest in the book is as the Cold War, for example, came to an end, it became less fearsome, the convergence between classical music and world politics came to an end, and I think that made it classical music less politically consequential. That's one factor, I think. There are, though, other things I think at work. And again, these are just the impressions of someone who I was once a classical musician, and I thought a lot about classical music. Several things I think are going on here. On the one hand, we have, in the post-war period, maybe the 50s and 60s, you have the emergence of of new vernacular types of music, rock music, other forms of pop music. That clearly drew people in that direction. I think education, music education is a factor, and I think fewer resources are being channeled that way. So children they're not exposed to the kind of musical education, say, that I had when I was growing up. And that, if you do that with elementary school students and middle school students and high school students, eventually that's probably going to have some sort of an impact on the audience for classical music. Finally, and there may be other things that you all can suggest. Finally, I think the emergence of, on the one hand, television, but also digital culture, which is enormously attractive. It's an attraction and a distraction, I think has made it more or less likely for people to, as children particularly, pursue a much more sort of contemplative thing like learning an instrument, even joining ensembles and things of that sort. And I think that people, as a result of that, they grow up less committed to classical music than, say, they did in my generation. And the implications of that is that it is less appealing to the nation as a whole. But again, I stress that that's not something that I explored in a systematic way in the book. The book is really about the past rather than the present, but that's what I can do there. You asked a question about politics and
Well, you kind of answered it in the sort of the first point you made, which was, well, maybe part of it, or you think probably part of it was with the declining interest in the sort of politics that had played such a big role in classical music, the world of classical music in the country, that sort of the two were supporting each other.
That convergence came to an end.
And once one of them came somewhat to an end, and the other global politics were less about, till more recently, less about Europe and more about other parts of the world that don't have a.
Yes, I think that's correct. Yeah. Thank you. Anyone else?
I guess I might be next. It sounds like the Shostakovich Seventh was popular, among other reasons, because it had a narrative. I mean, it delivered a message of triumph over evil, etc. And I'm just wondering, to what extent did other pieces of music fall into that category? Were any, for example, deliberately commissioned in order to portray a message about the culture?
I can't tell you off the top of my head whether any pieces were commissioned. What I can say is that I think it was the opinion of people at the time, and it was sort of, as I looked and studied the sources from the period, the Shostakovich had it was kind of sui generis in some way. It was one of a kind. There was no other piece captured the country's attention in that way. And I think it was precisely because of the politics of the piece. You mentioned that it had a narrative to it, which people were familiarized with. By the way, it was not... if you read the music criticism at the time, and I talk extensively about this in the book, a lot of music critics thought it was a rather bad piece of music. Nobody said it was a great piece. A handful of people did, but most didn't. And I would tend to agree with that it isn't a great piece of music. Nevertheless, what it did was it tapped into this necessity for fortifying this relationship with the Soviet Union, and the alliance was, certainly early on, it was a rather uncomfortable thing. This was not a state with the United States had a lot in common with, and anything that the U.S. government could do to help fortify that, it took advantage of, this being one example of that. I'm not sure what else you asked about other pieces. I'm not sure. I mean, certainly there are examples which I think are anomalous or surprising, I should say, where, for example, German music was used during World War II to inspire people. The story of German music, which I tell extensively in here, during World War II in the United States was completely different from what had happened during World War I. So, for example, Toscanini at war bond concerts, when he's trying to raise money for the U.S. government, conducts Wagner, and people love hearing it. And that was done through, German music was played throughout the country, and people listened to it with great enthusiasm, often in these kind of patriotic settings where they were attending concerts which had a kind of patriotic subtext to them. So that is rather intriguing. I don't know if that completely answered your question, but it's the best I can do at the moment. Yes, sir.
Yes, your book is about classical music and its impact on the United States.
Yes.
I became a great admirer of Arturo Toscanini because he stuck his neck out, way out, in Italy against Benito Mussolini.
Yes.
To what extent did Toscanini have an impact in this country as he led the New York Philharmonic?
Great. That's a great, excellent question. And you're absolutely right. Did you say Toscanini was a hero of yours? Did you say that? Because he's a hero of mine, too. So we can agree on that. And Toscanini's heroism, as it were, his musical heroism, goes back, it really begins in the early 1930s. And the thing that's interesting about that, when he begins to speak out against Mussolini, not only speak out, but when he was in Italy, and I have quite a bit of discussion in the book on Toscanini. He is literally physically endangered in Italy. He is conducting in situations where he doesn't agree to play certain pieces of Italian patriotic music, and he's physically attacked at one point. He does this sort of thing, speaking out against fascism throughout the 30s and the 40s. I believe he becomes and I should say, people listen to it. I mean, his rhetoric, his discourse, when he writes articles in the newspaper and magazines, as well as being interviewed, his voice is listened to across the country. If you look at newspapers across the country, they are documenting what Toscanini has to say on the subject of fascism. He is a very, very important figure. Again, suggesting, I think, what the role a classical musician could once play in the United States. If I don't know of any, well, maybe there are a few conductors at the moment who are playing that kind of role in contemporary political life in this country. Toscanini absolutely did. There were some others, but he was very, very important in that respect, and I think did behave quite heroically. And political leaders recognized it. Franklin Roosevelt, was a great admirer of perhaps not Toscanini's conducting, but the political role that he played, speaking out against fascism, and the it's a kind of constant as you look at American political discourse in the 1930s and up through the end of World War II. Toscanini is ever present in this anti-fascist discussion. And again, people were listening to it. It wasn't like he was just speaking to the New York Times. His words were covered across the country, indeed even across the world. Koussevitzky was another one who was rather important in this way. Toscanini, though, I think, the person of preeminent importance.
I just want to make a comment that is pertinent here. The reason the U.S. government got involved in this was because the Soviet Union had no private sector, and any kind of cultural exchange had to be a government-to-government operation. Today, the Mariinsky comes here, Gergiev, everything's going on, but their structure required that the U.S. government make official exchange agreements with the Soviet Union for this to take place. So that was the primary thing, not the funding for it, because I think a lot of the funding did not come from the U.S. government. It came from the orchestra itself. Today, orchestras make their own arrangements to go to Eastern Europe, but in those days, it was all completely state-controlled.
Just to clarify that, in this early period, the funding was provided by the U.S. government. I'm not sure if
100%?
Virtually 100%. In the 1950s...
certainly the U.S. government saw that it would have some advantages for being involved in this.
More than saw that it had advantages, there were extensive hearings in the Congress and the Senate and the House. Initially, the Eisenhower administration was acutely aware of this. This is something that, and I discuss in the book, was widely discussed in government circles as to why this is something that the U.S. government needed to do. It became, well, as I said, cultural diplomacy as a form of diplomacy really emerges in a significant way in this period, and the U.S. government is intimately, acutely involved in it because it sees, initially at least, that the Soviets are doing this and we needed to respond to it. Later on, there was more of a sort of private-public partnership with corporations and so forth donating money for some of these trips. But the early trips were, I believe, exclusively funded by the U.S. government.
John, wonderful talk. You mentioned some of the storms that erupted with the orchestras when there were boycotts with some of the German members and put into prison camps. And I was just wondering, in general, you mentioned Boston as a major symphony orchestra, but through the wars, was there an effect on orchestras in America? Like, was there perhaps less attendance during the wars that then would pick up after?
No, I don't think that was the case. I mean, this furor that I was discussing really happens during World War I, the anti-German furor. There is no anti-German furor, for the most part, in the music world during World War II in the United States. The only piece that is banned in the United States is Die Meistersinger. That's not played during the war, and Madame Butterfly. But because it made Japanese people sort of look better than Americans, so they decided to ban it. Those were the only two pieces played. During World War I, if I'm understanding, this happened across the country. I mean, I'm not sure exactly what you're asking, but there was virtually every symphony orchestra in the United States was affected by this in one way or another, whether the conductor was dismissed, sometimes imprisoned, they lost musicians, and it also happens in the Northeast, it happens in the Midwest, and it happens in the West. The South, at this point, there weren't any symphony orchestras, as far as I know, in the South at that point. So it really is happening. There's no kind of regional variation in it. It happens across the country, and it even in a place like Boston, for example, where this was particularly unpleasant. Karl Muck is imprisoned, and they fire a number of members of the orchestra. Boston didn't even have a very large German population. Other cities did. New York had a very significant German population. Chicago did. Cincinnati did. But Boston didn't. Despite that, this kind of scourge sort of washed over the city of Boston as well. So we can't even point to the fact that there might be a lot of Germans in a particular place that seemed to lead to this. That really didn't seem to affect it at all. New York as well was very adversely affected by it. We need some music to end this thing.
I don't want to go to the microphone. But
Okay.
What did you play? What musician? What do you play?
I was a trumpet player. Yeah. I am not any longer a trumpet player, but I was a trumpet player. Yes.
I have one quick question. I wondered whether you would consider the playing of Beethoven's Ninth at the Fall of the Wall an example of a more modern day.
Yeah, I think that is a good example. In fact, I believe I had that in an early draft of the book, and for some reason I had to cut thousands of words, and that was one of the stories that went. But I do think that is an example of the politicization of classical music. It's a wonderful example of it, absolutely. Bernstein being involved in that, absolutely the case.
How did you decide to do this book?
Yeah, that's a yes. I'll get a bit personal now. Obviously, throughout my life, I was always devoted to classical music. From the time I started playing when I was a little boy, but became much more committed to classical music as I got into my teens, and then I went to music school and worked as a musician. So classical music was always an important part of my life. Oddly enough, so was history and international affairs. I was always extremely interested in that as a kid, and but I went off and did music, and then for a whole variety of reasons, wound up going into academia. But I always had these two strong interests, classical music and sort of history and world affairs. And after I had finished a couple of books on civil rights, I wanted to try to figure out to see if there was a way to meld these two interests. And I thought about it for a long time. I discussed it with some of my friends. And I thought that there was something there. I didn't exactly know what it was. And I went to the New York Public Library and began reading through old newspapers, which historians do a lot of. And I began to see certain kind of patterns emerge in the sources. And as I kind of traversed the century, the 20th century, I saw these things emerging, which suggested to me that with a more concentrated, focused effort, I could fashion a book out of it. And so it really is a reflection of those two, I forgive the word passions, it's an overused word, but it's a reflection of those two passions, classical music and history and world affairs, yeah. Thank you. Thanks very much.